Oh, that integral time that you were describing, I mean, it really is kind of like a recognition of the world organism and you being a part of that, So it's like a simultaneity of the whole past of the cosmos and the present and the future. Like a normal, like anyone's lifetime.
It's organic in the sense that, I think we need to distinguish the Aristotelian organic from the Whiteheadian organic.
Okay.
Aristotle's great, and I think Gebser sees him as really deficient mentality in its, most excellent form.
Mm-hmm.
And, Aquinas he sees as, already halfway to deficiency, though also highlighting an important inception of the integral with his more participatory aspects.
Mm-hmm.
And then with modern philosophy, all hell breaks loose and mental consciousness becomes totally deficient, alienated, world-destroying, etc.
Mm-hmm.
But the Whiteheadian organism is different from the Aristotelian in the sense that what Gebser's worried about is that organism can seem too closed. Think about critiques of fascism as a kind of absorption of the individual into the social organism.
Yeah.
So Gebser is worried about that move, and so he wants to conceive of organism as, like Whitehead does, like a society.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not just autopoiesis, it's sympoiesis.
Yeah.
It's always open to relationship with a greater beyond. So the whole it's almost like the whole is incomplete perpetually, only because it's always becoming more whole.
Mm-hmm.
You could say that's all the organism already implies that in Aristotle, but his teleology is a little bit more circular.
Yeah. Well, I think I was thinking more when I use that, I guess the person who's influenced me the most at this point in the usage of that term is Steiner.
Organism.
So I would think of it in similar way to Whitehead's, where it's not closed and it's being continuously recreated by, other realms of beings of other, I guess, ontological, I don't know what word to use, but hierarchy, I guess.
Spiritual ecology. So Steiner's evolutionary. His organicism is open and processual in the way that Whitehead's is.
Yeah. The way that Gebser describes the ever-present origin kind of is reminding me of that.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a kind of more descriptive, less mythic, more conceptual description. Still with more myth, in the terms than in others.
Yeah, well, I think Gebser certainly wanted to say that the integral structure recovers myth in an efficient way, and still recovers mental, scientific, rational consciousness in an efficient way too. Just not that it just doesn't get possessed by them.
What does he mean by efficient?
Well, he has efficient and deficient phases of each structure of consciousness.
Yeah.
And so it's like when the wave is cresting and the structure is coming into its own as a distinct form of consciousness, it's efficient, right? And it reaches an apex, and then it begins to fall.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And as it falls, the new structure starts to rise. And so there's always a double kind of motion going on.
Yeah, there's symmetry. It's it reminds me a lot of morphology, just that.
It's a morphological process for sure.
Whenever I was reading it, the summaries about it, that's what I was getting. It's like a, living, dying, renewing process.
And yet Gebser's also, he goes to great lengths. He starts his book with this whole chapter on why he doesn't call it an evolution.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting, yeah.
Because he's worried about the idea of progress would obscure the process he's describing, which is a process of a structuration of some kind, I guess, that he wants to see as non-directional. He thinks the directional notion of evolution is too mental. So he's like, it's more than just an evolution in that sense, at least.
Mm-hmm.
But it just depends what we mean by evolution.
Yeah. How many dimensions? I guess how many layers of evolution, or on like realms? I guess. I'll try to describe it exactly, but.
Oh, I guess Gebser's saying if we're going to talk about evolution, we have to accept that it has a richer dimensional texture than just any conception of linear.
I think that's what we were talking about the other day. It's just there's something in the word evolution evokes, kind of neo-Darwinian linear thinking.
Well, it also
connotations.
Invokes hierarchy.
Yeah.
And that, the best survive. And that, it has all of these social...
Yeah, exactly.
Moral
neo-Darwinian
connotations. Yeah. And so, like, if we are going to recover or rescue the word, is it the word, or is there a concept that we could use a different word for?
I think it's the word. People are so used to using it, they use it in relation to themselves. Today, it's a big part of how people speak. I think especially a lot of younger people. And they want to, it's part of the way that people speak about self-actualization.
Right. But isn't that part of the very improvement complex and this paradigm of progress that Gebser was critiquing?
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, I think then you can't escape you can't have any kind of striving without calling it progress. If it gets to a point where we're just calling any kind of, I think of it as more of like a growth process, and there have been cultural forces, and this is the more, I guess, the authentic dimension of it, because it's not all, this doesn't describe every example, but that, to me, it has more to do with like the intuition of a telos and purpose, and that people want to. I think of it actually in that kind of organismic sense of like becoming most fully, and so that's
So,
but then, go ahead.
I'm just thinking about teleology and the difference between an Aristotelian and, say, a Whiteheadian or a Steinerian, or I think Gebserian as well, conception of organism, or teleology, And so Aristotle didn't have any sense of, like, evil in the world. There was disordered motion, but ultimately the elements know where to go, and there's no great tragedy that led to the beginning of history. It's not headed towards some great tragedy. We're just kind of here, and the news is thinking itself and emanating into a world that more or less is going to keep doing its thing forever. And a more contemporary sense of what teleology might mean, what organism or evolution might mean, there's not as much self-assurance about perfection and like the static crystalline structure of being. There's more of a sense of contingency and risk and uncertainty and like evil. Steiner had a lot to say about evil, just as Whitehead did, and but Aristotle doesn't. There's no so how do we... This is one of the other differences, I think. Gebser also is always saying, like, the integral might not emerge. Clearly, its potential is there if we look at history and the structures that we have that we have transformed through. But it's not a given that integral consciousness is going to manifest on the earth.
Mm-hmm.
And so we could fail.
Yeah.
And that highlights the importance of freedom in a way that wasn't all that important for, like, Aristotle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and I would connect that with
You want to go this way?
tell us. Either way.
Okay.
Not really.
We're going to come back and go that way.
Yeah. That's why I'd rather go later, because then we won't do this one. Right?
Right.
So, yeah, that in relation to tell us.
Yeah, so it's just a different kind of, at least a different kind of spiritual orientation. It's more participatory
Well, I
at
think
the level of will.
Yeah, related to also this different sense of time. You know, if the beginning and the future, or origin and the future and the whole past are with me in the present, yeah, that's not the same kind of, I guess, experience of the purpose. Yeah.
Yeah, so the presence of origin is what Gebser thinks the integral is really trying to realize.
Mm-hmm.
So a different conception of time as, you know, as Whitehead put it, like the full amplitude of time is present in each moment. So in other words, eternity is in each moment. Eternity is everlasting time.
Yeah.
Because, you know, if eternity can be imaged as a moving cosmos, as Plato says, then I think that says eternity is not, like, separate from time. It's just everlasting time. It's the how does Jake put it? Jake Sherman, that when he says,
You mean transcendence?
Transcendence is a superlative form of immanence.
Yeah.
Just as eternity is the superlative form of time.
Mm-hmm.
That's what Gebser is pointing us to.
Yeah. I like that emphasis. Because others say things like that too, but he makes it a bit more, like, visible by emphasizing it, you know, by naming his entire book after it. And it's spiritual, he says.
Yeah.
And so are the, I guess, from what I've learned so far, he says the structures are as well.
The structures are spiritual?
They derive from spiritual processes.
Well, yeah, I think origin, whatever, it's not material.
Yeah. No, I'm just saying that, yeah, like these actual structures of consciousness were described as being, you know, wrought by spiritual processes.
Yeah.
To me, it sounds like an evolution of consciousness.
Well, I think as long as we're understanding evolution again through dimensions which include the physical but aren't limited. Yes,
exactly.
Or include the biological but aren't limited.
Yeah, those are, I like that we're making these distinctions, because I guess I don't always realize that that's not. See, that was, I think, what I was speaking to the other day when I was trying to, I guess, characterize what felt to me like the general way in which people think about the evolution of consciousness, as if it's very spatialized. It's almost like a kind of infection being passed around. That's how I think sometimes people think of it, and then it just lends itself to, you know, being thought of atomistically and more, and also antagonistically.
Right. Because, you know, analytic or just any academic philosophers are going to be tempted to look at Gebser and say, well, is he a materialist, a dualist, or an idealist? And clearly he's not a materialist, and he's not a dualist, so he must be an idealist. But I think his spirituality is deeper than that.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, I think
these are modern.
Like Whitehead too.
These three categories for ontology are modern, and so they're, in a sense, trapped in the deficient mental structure of consciousness. So
Yeah.
to try to understand Gebser by reference to those is to just sort of show that you're not thinking in an integral way.
Mm-hmm.
You're force-fitting something novel into old categories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I feel like ultimately those categories, you know, they I guess every philosopher is unique, you know. But I guess some do more explicitly, you know, claim to be something rather than something else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, maybe, although it's fallen out of favor with the rise of scientific materialism and modern philosophy, the old realism, nominalism distinction, I think is important.
Yeah.
When we're talking about evolution.
Uh-huh.
Because for a nominalist, post-Darwin, a species is just a sort of made-up category.
Uh-huh.
There really is no essence
Yeah.
or archetype that defines a species.
Yeah. It's just totally like contingent, you know.
Darwin thought it was gradual change based on a sort of environmental condition and the struggle for existence that shaped organisms in this sort of passive way. The organism has no role to play other than trying to survive and reproduce, but there's no consciousness or agency given to the organism in its own evolution, and it's nominalist in the sense that the organism has no species mind to draw upon in the sense of an actual, you know, intelligence like wolf essence.
Yeah.
That informs
Like the group
each
soul.
individual wolf. Yeah. You'd need to be a realist to affirm something like that. And after Darwin, you can't use the old Aristotelian or Platonic notions, really. And you can adapt them, but you need to be more evolutionary.
Yeah.
The species isn't a fixed category. It's a real category, but it changes.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why you need a new logic for that.
Yeah.
That's why I'm interested in people like the American pragmatists like Peirce and James and Whitehead's Inheritance, because they re-establish a realistic logic, and so ontology.
Yeah.
It's like, I hope your ontology is realistic, otherwise what are you even doing? But they place logic on an evolutionary grounding. That ing is very important because it's not foundationalist, it's on a ground, it's a grounding. So it's fallible, it's open inquiry, it needs to be constantly updated. Because it's a form of semiosis and interpretation, which means it's in relationship and dialogue with the world.
It's learning.
It's learning. Yeah.
Organism.
Right.
But yes, I guess.
So it gives the agency
Really
back
characterized.
to the organism too. Yeah. So it's like we're inheriting a bunch from Aristotle and Plato, but
Yeah,
We're
but
also
we're not. Yeah, it's
evolving.
not exactly the same. Yeah,
we're mutating.
they were human too.
Gebser does use the phrase mutation of consciousness.
Oh yeah, he does.
So it's like, all right, you're really having to like beg us not to use evolution to describe
Yeah, I know. That's what I was thinking when I was reading. I was like, how is this not? But that shows, you know, I think this is what it's been great that you've been bringing out these redefinitions of organism and, you know, purpose and or telos, and because I think, I guess, like, as someone who's alive in 2021 and, you know, been, you know, reading these thinkers, I have, it's not always obvious to me when, like, what seems like, for example, like in using the term organism, I guess, not anachronistic to me, has a lot to do with who I've read and not always recognizing enough how the terms have transformed. You know, but even though I guess not having enough appreciation for what the older one meant, or and the difference.
Right. Yeah, I mean, in some way, it's just a move from like a steady state conception of systems to a emergent,
open,
complex, dynamical understanding of systems.
It's like
but
the integration of the limit and the unlimited.
the infinite. It's like fractal mathematics
Period.
rather than Euclidean geometry.
Yeah.
And topology as well. Fractal topologies, right? Where measurement becomes secondary. This is one of the...
And you attune.
You tune. Right. You are the instrument. You don't need a separate ruler that you hold up in front of you. You become the measure yourself. And that's where...
The instrument.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So...
I was, just as an interesting example of this, I was reading this book by a woman who was a professional singer, and she worked with Steiner, and they were re-envisioning the craft of singing, what it meant in the light of anthroposophy. And the way she talks about it is like just totally, I mean, it's more like that. It's more like the act of singing and like the way in which one does that is like something that is more explicitly interfacing with the rest of the world. Like more and consciously, I guess, in that sense. Like it's almost like the capacity for singing becomes almost like it transcends the individual doing the singing, and almost like gifts it. So you just have to kind of like, I guess, develop yourself to be a good receiver.
Yeah. You know, in Gebser's terms, I'm just thinking about like the magical structure of consciousness when song and dance was what organized our consciousness and organized our societies, and that even for someone who's, you know, striving to stabilize integral consciousness as their center of gravity, I think song and dance might still be essential to doing that. If integrality is a transparency of consciousness to the prior phases of its unfolding, then like at the magical structure in that magical world, I mean, you couldn't commune with the divine without song.
Yeah, well, and you know, because
it
imitates the movements of the heavens.
Right. So what might seem primitive to a modern person,
Coyotes.
Yeah, I think a coyote got a bunny back there. What might seem primitive to a mental, rational consciousness, for the integral consciousness needs to be recognized as essential. Like, you need to pick up those practices again.
Yeah, it just made me curious about sort of creating, you know, based on like a exploration of the geometries that are made between the planets. Some translating that into forms of dance routines and music, and just experimenting with it and just doing a kind of phenomenology of the practice, and see what I guess arises and what kind of state of consciousness it elicits. Just curious.
Yeah, I mean, we have to experiment with ritual technologies and
Rhythms.
reattune our instruments.
But I think this is a more, like, it's a, you know, the kind of phenomenological, like, openness, rather than what I think a lot of people try to do, which is to kind of, I don't know, contrive a ritual.
Yeah.
And it's almost like it's very, the presence of capitalism is very prominent, I think. And because it's almost made into a product to be consumed, and the experience. And also, like, I think there's a lot of psychological projection. Yeah. That, you know, and just kind of, well, very insulated experiences.
Yeah.
The call of mirrors, sort of.
Sure.
Not all of it, of course.
It is difficult for a mental, rational, individual ego, you know, formed by a society that doesn't just individuate us, actually doesn't individuate us at all in the Jungian sense, but hyper individualizes us such that we're cut off from, you know, family bonds, community bonds, and forced to face society as an individual competing in a marketplace. And in that situation, it's pretty much impossible to create an authentic ritual.
Well, because everybody's...
You'd be more likely to buy someone else's.
Yeah.
Which is what people do now, with going on ayahuasca retreats or wilderness rites of passage, or even still people who get, like... Well, I guess you're a teenager when you get bat mitzvah or bar mitzvah, so maybe you're not yet a fully individualized ego, but I think a lot of even the old religious rites have become turned into a consumer good.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would not, I think it's more complex than, I wouldn't just, with different plant medicine ceremonies and people who do the vision quests. And
I don't mean to totally dismiss that either.
I think those especially, they induce non-ordinary states of consciousness, and they're like this attempt to keep things alive that have transformed, but that they create the potential for something more to come in, I think, and that is more than human.
Yeah, no,
it helps shape.
I agree. I mean, even in the context of a global capitalist society, these sorts of rituals, though they're commodified just by virtue of the fact that you have to fly there, and pay some money to be able to do it.
They're kind of subversive to the whole thing.
Yeah.
They can be.
Well, they can be if they allow that hyper-individualized ego to die to its old sense of identity.
Yes.
And find a new identity and not just lose themselves.
Yeah, if that's not happening, then you hear about, ayahuasqueros who are, taking advantage of people, or people from the West going down there and just, destroying things and,
So we don't yet have the bridges we don't have well-constructed bridges yet to carry, modern egos across the threshold of the death of that identity into a new identity, which I think Steiner and Gebser think has something to do with the Christ consciousness.
Gebser as well. Oh yeah, he does. Yeah. It's a kind of individuality. And the thing
with Steiner and for Gebser, I think, is that Christ isn't just a sort of sectarian religious symbol anymore.
Yeah, it's like
Christ includes Buddha. Christ includes Krishna. They're all part of that Christic being, that Christic power. And so I think it's non-denominational. It's not Christian in a sectarian sense at all.
Yeah, it's like the sun. It's like how the sun draws things out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it's shining on all of us.
So it's a shame that the existing churches can't be that bridge to carry egos across, because they've been possessed. I mean, Steiner says they've been possessed by Ahriman. Mm-hmm. And so they just foster the ego. And in America, you get the prosperity gospel where it's all about, God loves you if you make a bunch of money, and that's the proof.
God, that's crazy.
And so it's so Ahrimanic and materialistic and egoistic, and a total perversion of of Christ's teachings, Jesus's words, as even in the gospel that's in the official Bible. Some of the other gospels are quite, they're very Taoist, I find. They're amazing. But it's just a shame, because we have all this church infrastructure and all this psychic energy bound up with it, and all it's serving is
it's one of the reasons why
the death clutch
so many people hate religion.
Ego
They don't
mentality.
like the word religion.
Yeah.
They're like, ugh, get that out of... It's like, you study religion? Why?
Because, I think the proper response to that is to say, well, you have a religion, you just don't call it that.
Well, in response to that, I'm usually a bit more like trying to elicit the aspect of the person that is reverent. You know, because I'm like, you know what I'm talking about.
Well, I mean, there are some...
That's what religion is.
There are some religions of reverence, but there are also other religions that are not about that.
Well, I know. I'm just saying that I think every human being has that in them, and that to me is religion, you know, in its essence.
I think it's... I like forms of religion that are about reverence, because I think those are more attuned to being, but there are also false religions, maybe we have to qualify them as, which are more about like just authentication, where it's all about, you know, or some that are more hedonistic, or some religions that are, I mean, think about any of the biblical religions as they've been practiced, at least, you know, in a widespread way by the average person and society. I mean, they're horrifically violent. They justify all sorts of murderous atrocities based on doctrines in their books, and that continues to go on today. That's not a religion of reverence.
Not at all.
But it's religious. Otherwise, what are we even going to use the word for?
Yeah, I guess you're right. Well, but I think this is... Okay, to bring up William Desmond again. What was it? That like, true religion, in my point of view, is like when there's like an inflowing of like... I don't know, an inflowing of like the kind of primal truth, and it sort of inspires an agapic relation towards things, and that everything else is just counterfeit.
I guess you could experience that in science and in art as well as in religion, right? So
yeah, well, you know, if we think these can ever be reintegrated, then yeah.
So true religion is also science and is also art, I think. Whereas there are these false forms of religion that are cut off from the true and the beautiful and obsessed with some imagined good that's not the real good. Some idol, yeah. How could the real good be disconnected from the true and the beautiful? I mean...
Yeah. That was one of the... I mean, to me... Because I didn't learn that until, you know, like, the last 5 years. Because I had never read Plato before, and I just had never had an introduction to Western philosophy. Like, from the... Except for in ethics, but it wasn't, I guess... It didn't convey this to me. Just this notion of the good, the true, and the beautiful. And when as a, you know, in my 20s, discovering that, I guess, foundational notion to, you know, what they call the West, I was like, wow, I just feel it's so intuitively to be true that the good, the true, and the beautiful are all together. This is so great. This feels like it actually accords with how I feel about things, in contrast to the way that, you know, I've learned from my culture. Yeah. In my time. Well, gives you which does not make that very visible.
Well, it gives you a multi-dimensional compass to orient yourself. You know?
Yeah. It is a kind of qualitative... it's an expression of the qualitative dimension of being.
Yeah. And I think Jean Gebser, in his book The Ever-Present Origin, deserves to be considered one of the great attempts to articulate that sort of agapic vision that you were describing in his own place and time.
Gebser?
Yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful.
So it's prophetic in that sense, that it is, you know, I think he did tap into some eternal truth.
Did that 20th century, those philosophers, so many amazing philosophers in the 20th century.
Yeah.
As you were saying.
Yeah.
As you were saying.
That's it. I just wanted to honor his contribution
Gebser.
and encourage people to read his book.
Yes.